Do you get creeped out easily? Let me know because we're just getting started. This is the scariest hotel room in America. So let me set the scene. It's 1935 and this grand old hotel has seen better days. The elegant facade hides a building that is tired, outdated, and struggling to stay afloat. The hotel president in Kansas City was built in 1928. The 12-story skyscraper was one of the tallest buildings in town. By the mid-1930s, though, people thought of it as just another old hotel with chipped paint, threadbare carpets, and leaky plumbing. But its most significant flaw was a lack of guests. Business had slowed since the stock market crash. People weren't traveling like they used to. And this hotel was one of many empty. Then everything changed. January rolled around and a new guest arrived. He registered in the lobby using the name Roland T. Owen. But there was something about him that made the hotel staff uneasy. You see, he didn't have any luggage, just a small comb, toothbrush, and a single hairbrush. But it was his face that really gave the staff the heebie-jeebies. They said he had sunken eyes. In fact, when he registered, the clerk had to lean in close to see his eyes at all. But despite their apprehension, they showed him to room 1046. It was an interior room with no windows overlooking the street, exactly how he'd requested. But what happened behind that door would make room 1046 infamous. A few things about him. They noticed that he spent most of his time alone in his room, barely ever leaving. And when he did, he was always dressed in black. He rarely ate meals in the dining room. Instead, he ordered food up to his room. And when the waiters knocked on the door, he wouldn't answer. They would have to use the master key to enter and find him, sitting on the bed with the door open as if waiting for them. But the most disturbing thing was the phone calls. Time and again, the staff would hear him talking in hushed tones. They couldn't hear what he was saying, but it sounded like he was having an intense conversation with somebody. In fact, on January 5th, they heard him say, "Don't bring anything. I'll be back soon." And then he hung up. The staff immediately went to the front desk to report it, but there was nothing they could do. They knew he had a right to privacy, and frankly, they were worried he might snap if they trespassed. It wasn't until 2 days later that a maid finally worked up the courage to knock. She needed to change the linens, but after 5 knocks and no answer, she unlocked the door with the master key and stepped inside. What she found was terrifying. First, the room was completely dark, even during the day. The curtains were drawn tight and the room was freezing cold. But it was when she approached the bed that her blood ran cold. Sitting motionless was a man in his late 40s. He was wearing a black suit, and his eyes stared blankly ahead. At first, the maid assumed he was dead. But when she walked closer, she realized he was still breathing. She screamed and ran to the elevator, but the man in room 1046 wasn't done with her yet. As she rode down the elevator, she turned to see him standing in the shaft. He was barefoot and his clothes were rumpled, but he was staring directly at her. The next day, the same maid returned with the night auditor. Still, they couldn't get Mr. Owen to respond. And when they opened the closet, they found a second key. Not only did Mr. Owen have access to the room's key, but he had a master key that unlocked the room from the outside. Whoever he was, he clearly didn't want anyone in his room. But it wasn't long before someone did. At 7 a.m. on January, the switchboard operator heard the phone in room 1046 come off the hook. She tried to call back, but the line was dead. Bellboys were dispatched to check on Mr. Owen, but the first one refused to go in alone. Only when a second bellboy joined him did he agree. But when they reached the room, they were met with the horrifying sight of Mr. Owen kneeling on the floor. The men ran to get help, but by the time the police and doctors arrived, it was too late. The man was dead. And when the police searched the room, they found out why. The room was covered in blood. There were splatters on the walls, on the curtains, and on the sheets. But the worst was in the bathroom. The mirror was shattered and embedded in the man's head. The police identified him as Roland T. Owen, but those two names weren't his real ones. He'd registered in Kansas under the alias R. Todd and had used the name Roland T. Owen in Street. Lewis. But it wasn't until they opened the suitcase that they found his real identity. Inside was a small wooden box. And when the police opened it, they found these. These are the only pictures in the entire case file. The man in the photo is cleanly shaven. He looks respectable and has kind eyes. But here's where things get even stranger. When the police searched the rest of the room, they found no identification, no wallet, no cash, not even a cigarette or tobacco pouch. But they did find a newspaper clipping. It talked about the disappearance of a man named Paul Holes. He'd vanished without a trace 2 years prior. And although the police didn't know it, there was one more similarity between Mr. Holes and the man in room 1046. Both were born on January. The theory is that Paul Holes had amnesia. So he checked into the hotel with false credentials and ended up dying there. But even that doesn't explain why the room was filled with blood or why he murdered himself with a shard of glass. But here's the kicker. He wasn't alone. When the maid first discovered Mr. Owen in the room, he wasn't kneeling on the floor. He was sitting on the bed. And when the Bellboys entered, he wasn't in the corner. He was standing in the middle of the room. So if he was dead, how did he move? Could Paul Holes have been possessed by some evil force that eventually drove him to murder himself? Or was there someone else in that room, somebody sinister, who unlocked the door and moved the body? What makes this case so haunting is that nobody knows what happened. After the police finished their investigation, the hotel staff cleaned the room and put it back on the market. But something terrible happened. Guests began reporting strange occurrences. In fact, the Kansas City Star published an entire article about the room. It told the story of the mysterious death and the ensuing paranormal activity. But rather than scaring people away, it had the opposite effect. Thousands wrote to the hotel begging for a chance to spend a night in room 1046. Some even offered to pay double the presidential suite rate just to sleep in the haunted room. In the end, the hotel caved and started charging extra for the so-called haunted room. But it didn't last long. In 1976, the hotel closed. It was demolished in 1982 and nothing stands in its place to this day. But the mystery continues. There are still questions that need answers. Who was the man in room 1046? Was he truly Paul Holes, or was he someone else entirely? And if he was alive, why did he pretend to be dead? Or was he actually dead, and something evil took control of his body? We may never know. If you've watched my videos before, you know that I love unsolved mysteries. But this one takes the cake. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a thumbs up. Until next time.